सफ़े दहर से बातिल को मिटाया किसने, नौए इंसान को गुलामी से छुड़ाया किसने, मेरे काबे को जबीनों से बसाया किसने, मेरे कुरान को सीनों से लगाया किसने। थे तो आबा वो तुम्हारे ही, मगर तुम क्या हो।
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First of all, I want to thank Bilal for that wonderful introduction. However, I did hear something that I want to correct. Iqbal refuted many times that he was a poet. He never wanted to be recognized as a poet. Second word I heard was a sage. Iqbal never thought of him as a sage as well, a philosopher. Never, never. In fact, he criticized philosophy. He criticized philosopher. Falsafi and Rams kam fahmide ast, fikr ubar abu gil keshide ast. He criticized philosophers. Was he a scholar of Islam? Sorry, Bilal, he wasn't a scholar of Islam either. At least he didn't consider himself so. Who was Iqbal? What was his role? He's not a scholar, he's not a falsafi, he's not a poet. Who was he? This is what brings me to our lecture of today, because I believe he was a very, very vast personality, an ocean of a personality. We can never know truly the identity, the real identity of the man, until we actually look at his life history. For this reason, I'm going to devote, inshallah, this session looking into his life history. Because until or unless we know who he was, we can never appreciate his work. We can never appreciate his thoughts. So inshallah we're going to look at that. We will, however, I'm planning to inshallah look at his thought in more detail in the coming session. Okay, so this time we're going to more look into Iqbal, the man behind the ideas. This is so important, as you may well appreciate as well. One thing I want to ask people here, how many of you been to the Mausoleum of Iqbal at Lahore? Okay, so I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, oh wow, more people here. Okay, so we have about 10, 12 people. How many of you, people noticed that the birth year on the mausoleum, on the gravestone is wrong? Everybody notice that? The birth year of Iqbal is wrong. Well, this is one of the historical facts. And this again brings us to the original topic of this lecture. Many times we celebrate our heroes and we don't exactly know why. Sometimes our devotion, our link with our heroes is sentimental. It lacks depth. It is for this reason we have such gatherings, to actually explore beyond the superficial, to go beyond, what is told to us in the national myths. And we're going to inshallah explore that. I want to ask another question. How many aspects does a human have? How many aspects does a human have? Human itself, defining human. How many aspects does a human have? A person. Okay, I'll give you a hint. Physical is one of them. Physical. Spiritual. That's right, spirit. You're not only your physical self, but you're also your spirit. Right? When a person's spirit is out, then we refer to the body as it. It's no more a he or a she. Right? So spirit is a part of your identity. Physical self is a part of your identity. Right? What is the third aspect? Okay, virtue kind of comes into the spirit, right? Because, inner goodness is tied to virtue. So you have physical, you have
Mental.
exactly. So you have mental. So all three aspects exist within you. You have a physical self, you have a mental self, and you have a spiritual self. Now, there is a hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu it's very popular, in which the Prophet said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَبْعَثُ لِهَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ عَلَى رَأْسِ كُلِّ مِئَةٍ سَنَةٍ مَنْ يُجَدِّدُ لَهَا دِينَهَا. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, at the behest of every 100 years, after every 100 years, will raise someone or some people that will renew this religion for this ummah. Revivalists. They will revive this religion. Right? As if something has gotten old, will revive it. Now, if you go into this, the detail of this hadith, you will see that the word man, for example, does not refer to one person. Every 100 years, more than one people can come to revive this deen. So it's not always that we're waiting for always one person. The imam of all times is going to come if everyone. No, it could be more than one. It could be male or female. So what this hadith tells us is that every one of us here are potential mujaddids, are potential revivalists. We can do something to revive the deen in the lives of the people. We can all do that. This is an opportunity that we all have before us. Now, the reason why I mentioned the three aspects of humanity is because unless we appreciate the three aspects of humanity, three aspects of a person, we cannot appreciate the people who made strides, who put forth their efforts in order to make gains and make progress in those three planes, in those three aspects. What I mean is, for example, Yawm al-Badr, the Battle of Badr. What is it called in the Quran? One of the titles of Yawm al-Badr is, the Battle of Badr is Yawm al-Furqan. Does anybody know what Yawm al-Furqan? What does Furqan mean? Furqan, exactly. Partition, right? The day of the criterion. The day when truthfulness and falsehood are completely parted. That was determined on the day of Badr. But if you look at the actual battleground of the day of Badr, who was engaged? It wasn't just Sahaba. It wasn't just the warriors on the battlefield. The battle was being fought on three different planes. On three different planes. On the physical plane, it was Ashab al-Rasul against the Mushrikeen of Makkah. Yes? That was the physical plane. That's the plane that we live in. But there was another battle going on an intellectual plane. There were the shu'ara on either side that were doing hujum, that were basically attacking each other with words. So you had Meccan poets who were shooting the darts of their poetry towards the Muslims, and you had Muslim poets who were battling and rebutting or attacking the enemy with their poetry. So you had a physical plane, and then you had an intellectual plane. Okay? For example, Rasulullah sallallahu, who's the poet of Islam? The greatest poet of Islam. Hassan ibn Sabit. Right? The great poet of Islam. What does Rasulullah sallallahu said? He said, go and do huju of them. وَهُجُوهُمْ وَجِبْرِيلُ مَعَكَ. Go and attack them with your poetry. Jibreel is with you. This is the intellectual level. The Battle of Badr, there was another plane, and that was the intellectual plane. Then there was the spiritual plane. Who was fighting in the spiritual plane? It was Jibreel and the angels. And on the other side was who? Was Shaitan and his allies. And what did the Shaitan say when he saw Jibreel with his army of angels? He said, I have to flee, because I see what you people don't see. And he had to run away from that. So the thing is that the Battle of Badr, it was a battle of criterion on three different levels. On the physical, on the intellectual, and on the spiritual. The reason why we need to know that is because we also need to know that a mujaddid, a revivalist, does not have to be on one plane. It can be on many different planes. For example, there are mujaddideen amongst the fuqaha. Who are the fuqaha? People who talked about Islamic jurisprudence. Fiqh deals with what? Fiqh deals with the body, doesn't it? So there are people that gave laws. Imam Abu Hanifa, 1 million fiqh rulings, they say, before he died. That's a mujaddid. He made deen alive in the lives of the followers of Islam. And then there are what you call our mutakallimin, or those scholars that engaged in ideologies. They had an intellectual bent. You had like Imam Ghazali, for example. And there you have many, many people, who rebutted or rebuked or refuted the false ideologies. They were not people of the fiqh, they were people of kalam. So this is another plane, the plane of the mind. And then you have the spiritual plane, people of ihsan, people of tasawwuf, people of spirituality. And they had their own arena of battle, of war. So what I want you to appreciate is that when we talk about great figures of Islam, we must put them in a certain category. Where was their greatest contribution? Which plane did they make the most service to this deen and to this ummah? In my humble opinion, Iqbal was of the second category. He was a mujaddid of this deen, and he was a mujaddid on the intellectual plane. And people who know Iqbal, who've read Iqbal, and who appreciate Iqbal can certainly testify to what we're talking about. I want to give you a bit of background of and a bit of talk about the context that Iqbal was born in. What exactly happened? What exactly happened? What was the context that this man was born in? Well, basically what happened was, there was a time when you had the three major empires in the Muslim world. They were called the gunpowder empires. You had the Ottoman Empire in the west, you had the Safavid Empire in the middle, and you had the Mughal Empire in the east. So you had your three major empires before the era of colonialism, before the Europeans came in and they took over Islamic lands and then broke them into pieces. Now what happened was, basically the Mughal Empire was one of the most glorious empires, had a very glorious, rich history. When Europeans came in, they basically vanquished the Muslims. They took over, they replaced the rule. But the major threat that the Indian Muslims had was not so much that of, attack, war, but more that of ideology. If you look at India, for example, and those people who have studied Indian history, you can say that India is that culture or that nation. Whenever a new nation came into India, it amalgamated with Indians. It became a part. It lost their identity. Muslims are perhaps the only nation that can be identified with, that retain their identity. Why is that? There were three major attempts made to amalgamate Hindus and Muslims and to create something new. Perhaps you heard of the Bhakti movement. Sikhism was sort of like that compromise. Take some from Hinduism, take some from Islam. But these were attempts that were made time and time again in history. And there were mujaddideen, there were people who did tajdeed, revivalists, who came up and who countered this. First attempt was during Akbar, a 16th century emperor, a Muslim emperor, came up with what? Deen-e Ilahi, right? In his idea, it was basically we have come to this end of history, and here's a religion that will take the good of everything. So he took some of Hindu aspects and Hindu cultural aspects, religious aspects, and he took some of Islam, and then he made a religion out of it. And he sponsored and he promoted it amongst Muslims. Unfortunately, it was a double failure. But before it was rejected by the masses, there was a man that stood up to Deen-e Ilahi and such deviant views, and that was Sheikh Ahmed Sirhindi. He refused to do sajda. At that time, the emperor himself was a manifestation of God. And before you came into the court, you had to do sajda. He said no. And he went into the jail for, I believe, 8 years. But he did not do sajda. And he came back out and he actually revived the religion. He stood against the amalgamation of what Hinduism stood for and what Islam stood for. This was the first attempt. Second attempt was during the time of Aurangzeb, Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb. Shah Jahan was the second last great Mughal king. and he had two sons. Dara Shikoh was the eldest son, Aurangzeb was the younger son. Aurangzeb was a person of Sharia. Dara Shikoh was a person that was on that path, where he felt that the best way is to amalgamate Hindu aspects and then the Muslim aspects and create a synthesis of a new religion. Aurangzeb stood against it, and he brought back Sharia. Now, the way he did it is again, it's controversial. Whether Aurangzeb's, his strategy or his enforcement was based on, was it exactly what the times needed? But one thing we cannot discard is that was the second attempt where Hindus and Muslims, if this attempt was not stopped, they would have both lost their identity, and a hybrid religion would have, or a hybrid nation would have emerged. So Aurangzeb ruled, and as you know, in the 18th century, early 18th century, he dies. The third time when there's this slogan of Hindu-Muslim unity came up and Islam was in danger, the Islamic identity was in danger, was the most dangerous part of history. Why? Because at that time, Muslims had lost their political power. After Aurangzeb, they lost their political power. This was the time of Iqbal, where there were ulama, very respectable, very known, very you can say, ulama with a lot of, weight, honor in the eyes of people, and they came out and they say, Hindus and Muslims, they need to unite. Forget their differences. All come under one umbrella. Islam and Hinduism are basically one in their basic message. So another mujaddid was needed at this third time, when Muslims had lost political power, when they were at their lowest interval. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent a mujaddid to India in the form of Iqbal. And we will go over how that was a boon to the Muslims of the subcontinent. Now, after the fall of Mughal Empire and death of Aurangzeb, Muslims underwent a severe decline. British gradually took over. They came in as merchants, but then they took over, the subcontinent. Started from Bengal, but then they eventually moved up and they took over Delhi. 1937, Persian, our language, the state official language, that was abolished. Okay, new education system was brought in. New legal system was introduced. Qadis and Muslim landowners and Nawabs, they became paupers overnight. They had no utility in the new system. Right? So what happened is 1857. What happened in 1857? War of Independence or who says mutiny? Okay. So we have an ideological divide here. Okay, is it a mutiny or is it War of Independence? Depends which books you read of history. But the question is, it was the last attempt of Muslims as well as Hindus to throw off the yoke of the British rule. Did it succeed? Sorry?
And then in 1857, Muslims lost each and everything.
That's right. That's a very good point. Muslims lost more than Hindus did. It were Muslims that were targeted by the British government. Why? Well, for one reason is because they took power from the Muslims. So they were insecure. British were insecure. Second thing was that Muslims had in their religion this idea of jihad. To take back, go out and take back, and reassert your rule that has been taken away from you, from these people that have come from thousands of miles away. Right. There was also other reasons too. There was politics, there was revenge, there were jealousies, there were petty issues. Muslims were overall targeted. Their lands were confiscated. Muslims generally were not traders. Muslims were landowners. When their lands were taken away, basically their whole earning was gone. Their source of earning was gone. So you had Muslim elite becoming impoverished overnight. Worse than that, you had, for example, Muslims being killed. There was no security. There was no trials. Muslims were a lot of times, they were tied to the mouths of the cannons. Cannons were shot. 27,000 Muslims were killed, without a trial. So there was a lot of injustices that happened. It was a very tough time. Morale-wise, Muslims were at their lowest in India. So what happened was there were reform movements in India. There were some Muslims that said, no, we're going to fight this new order. Where did these reform movements emerge? They emerged in northwest of India, the area that we call, now it's called Pakhtunkhwa, right? The Sarhad, Punjab area. You had reform movements there, militant reform movements. And then you had reform movements all the way in the east of Bengal. Both were same in their nature in one respect. They were militant movements. They wanted to throw off the yoke of the British Empire by force. Did they succeed? Did those movements succeed? Anybody know? None of those movements succeeded. Their great leaders became martyrs in history. Right? So these movements even failed. Repercussions were that Muslims were executed in large numbers, 20,000 lands were confiscated, they were banned from public service. Worse of all, there was a Christianization policy. So British brought in Christianization policy. They brought in missionaries from Britain who would convert the Muslims. Right? After Tipu Sultan, in 1799 when he fell, and he, as you know, was a ruler of the state, southern state, Mysore. Muslims even tried hijrah. Okay, fine, if force doesn't work, let's do hijrah. So what did they do? Tens of thousands of them tried to do migration to Afghanistan. First, the Afghanistan, the ruler of Afghanistan welcomed them, but once the population pressure became too much, they closed the borders. Many Muslims died on the way. One eyewitness says that along the road you could see graves on either side. People who just couldn't make it back. So the point is, these were very, very tough times. And I want you to appreciate these lessons in history because Muslims are going through a very tough time again in global affairs. So I want you to always keep in back in mind how the coming of Iqbal, right, and this situation, how the context is similar to what we are in today. Now, what is needed? What do we do? Okay, we try to use force, we fail. We try to move, we fail. What is needed here? What Muslim thinkers of the time said, you know what? The only thing that will work is because we're not real Muslims. We need to become real Muslims. The reason why these efforts are failing, and we are in such an abject state, an abysmal state, is because we're not real Muslims. The times call for a change in perspective. The times call for a change of value system, a new psychology. So you had, for example, Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, a very great, intellectual leader, thinker, right? He came up and he said, you know what, you Muslims, if you boycott the British in protest, who's going to lose out? You guys are not going to lose out. The British are not going to lose out. You will lose out. So you try to show to the British that you are more faithful than the Hindus if you want to secure yourself a good future. Now again, we're not here to critique and we're not here to review or refute whatever Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan did. A lot of things that he did in good faith for the Muslim people. But in retrospect, when we look back, it was a wrong policy. The purpose of the Muslim was not to win favor of the British. The purpose of the Muslim was to discover or to rediscover what it is to be a Muslim. What is our objective? What are we as a nation about to do, should be doing? What is wrong with our Islam? Because the Quran promises us grandeur, it promises our victory. How come we're not getting victory and grandeur? My grandfather used to tell us, and he lived in those old times, he says, as soon as you get out of the house, what do you see? You see the pauper, the beggar, the person in rags and tatters is a Muslim. And the person in the car, in the houses, the person who lives well and has thriving business is a Hindu. You could clearly see this difference. And this created overall demoralization in Muslims. So when Iqbal entered the world, the stage was set. It was a very demoralizing picture. So in Sialkot somewhere, there is a humble cap maker, a person who makes caps, Sheikh Nur Muhammad. His nickname was Nathu Topiana in Punjabi. But subhanallah, when Allah wishes to revive a nation, He will cause it anywhere. He will make the source anywhere. So he had a son born. Just a few days before the son was born, he had a dream. He had a dream that he was on a vast ground. And there was a beautiful white pigeon flying in the sky. And many people wanted to catch this pigeon, but they couldn't catch the pigeon. What happened after some moments, that pigeon itself fell on his lap. And when he woke up, he realized, and he interpreted the dream, and he realized, now this person was of a very mystical bent, Nur Muhammad. He realized that he's going to have a son, number one. And number two, this son is going to serve the deen in some capacity. And lo and behold, a few days later, son is born. And true to the dream, he named the son Muhammad Iqbal, the fame of Muhammad. He's going to serve the deen. Now as a childhood, Iqbal was a very intelligent child. Once he was reading the Quran as a very young kid. We don't know much about Iqbal. We don't have any pictures of him when he was young. When he was reading, one scholar passed by, one literary figure, his name was Mir Hassan. And he looked at this kid, studying the Quran so diligently under the sun. And he went to the father and he said, why don't you have this son, admitted to my school, my madrasa? I want to teach him, because I see promise in him. So he had a little bit of a, tussle with the father, and eventually he won him over. So Iqbal became Mir Hassan's, prize student. Then, after all, Mir Hassan again went to the father and he said, you should also give him secular education, as well as religious education. And lo and behold, Iqbal was admitted to Scotch Mission, a missionary school. Right? Now, Mir Hassan would play a very pivotal role in Iqbal's life. In fact, there is a view that when Iqbal thought of Mard-e-Momin, the ideal believer, he had in the back of his mind the personality of Mir Hassan. A very, very close relationship he had with. There's a joke that once Mir Hassan, his teacher, took him to the bazaar, to the market area, and told him to take care of this little kid. His name was Ihsan. So Iqbal had to carry this kid Ihsan, right? And this kid became heavy. Iqbal became tired. So once Mir Hassan was not looking, Iqbal put the little kid Ihsan down. Mir Hassan came back and saw that Iqbal wasn't holding Ihsan anymore. And he said to him, Iski bardasht bhi dushwari hai? You find that this too hard? Carrying this? And you know what Iqbal said? As a kid, he said, Tera ihsan bada bhari hai. So the kid had poetic talent from the very young age, And this was his greatness. 11-year-old, the young Iqbal saw something that was mystical experience. A side of his father that he did not really know. As a young kid, woke up at night, heard his mother coming downstairs from the upper floor and wanted to follow the mother. The mother told him to go back to bed and sleep. Curious the kid that he was, he did not want to go back. And he followed his mother. Followed his mother right into the courtyard. When he went into the courtyard, he saw his father sitting in the courtyard. And he saw a halo of light all around the father. And he said he became completely shocked at seeing his father with this halo of light around him. The mother turned around and this time she was angry. She said, go back to bed. And he went back to bed quietly. And he thought about it. And he never realized that his father was in fact a great mystic in himself. A person who was ordinary, completely ordinary, but he was in fact, had some maqam, a spiritual status. And he later discovered that he was in fact one of the disciples of the great Sufi sheikhs of the time, Qazi Sultan Muhammad. Another memory that Iqbal has of his father is that one time his father woke up the wife and him, and he said, there is a caravan not too far from here, and there is a sick person in that caravan. This caravan has come all the way from Afghanistan, and there's a sick person, and I must go this night, and I must go and treat them. So imagine, waking up at night and having this news. So they actually took a tonga, a horse carriage, and they went to that caravan, and they said, you have a sick person in your caravan. In the darkness of the night, and they became surprised. He says, yes, we do. And the father, what he did was, he had some ashes with him, and he did some spiritual medicine, and he cured that person. Right? So this is just to show you what influence the father would have in the life of Iqbal. Once father saw him reading the Quran and told him, Iqbal, this is not the way to read the Quran. Read the Quran as if it is being revealed upon you. Become an active reader of the book. Which made Iqbal say once तेरे ज़मीर पे जब तक ना हो नुज़ूल किताब गिरा कुशा है नाराज़ी ना साहिब कशाफ. It means that you read the book with an active mind, as if it is being, as you are sahib kitab at that moment. Then you come to the academic life of Iqbal, very vibrant. He was a first division student throughout. He earned a medal, in grade 10. He earned the medal in his bachelor's. He was the highest, he earned the highest marks amongst the Muslim students of India at the time. At the same time, he wasn't a bookworm. He was a social bee. So his room, his dormitory room was always filled with people coming in, talking and all that. He was also, his good luck to have found a philosophy professor called Thomas Arnold. And if ever a professor and a student can be friends, he was in this situation. Thomas Arnold became a close friend of Iqbal and would later help him in his trip to England. Iqbal at the time, was growing up, he also would go and take part in poetic conferences. And he was celebrated as a poet of merit. In fact, at that time, he was an Indian nationalist. So he believed India was for Indians. Again, So his views themselves would undergo many changes. In 1905, he made that historic trip to England. Okay. From 1905 to 1908, these are the 3 years. Right? And these are the 3 years where we find a miracle, really. Never have I, at least in my observation, ever seen a person receive 3 academic degrees in 3 years. 3 academic degrees in 3 years. Iqbal did that. Right? So he did, he did a bachelor's in philosophy from Cambridge. Yes, I know, it is quite a feat. So he did bachelor's from Cambridge, and then he did his law from Lincoln's Inn, and then he did his PhD from Munich University. So 3 degrees in 3 years. It's quite a trip. And there, what he did was, when I came across this trip to England, was that even though there's not a lot of poetry, but the voyage to England was very interesting because he went by ship. My grandfather too went by ship, and you got to see much more than you would, now it's just a small plane ride. But it's just so interesting the things that he saw and things that he witnessed and things that he shared. But what I want to say is that he was never a person who was beset with inferiority complex of any sort. He always thought of himself as a self-assured person. There was an incident, for example, well actually quite many incidents that we have in his 3-year stay. One incident was when he was with his landlady, and his landlady was British, and she once asked him, and she says, Iqbal, why do you always take a water pot into the washroom, to the bathroom? Right? So Iqbal was not the person to be shy about it. He told her quite openly, he says, well, I'm a Muslim and Islam stresses tahara, purification. And then, this is the reason why you take the bath, And then it says that she recognized it and she said she should have this practice as well. So he wasn't the person who would shy away, from the truth or from what Muslims believe in. There was one time in Scotland, he went on a vacation with a friend of his to Scotland, and there was a missionary who had just come from India. And he was addressing a large gathering, and he was telling them, what Indians are like, and he had this slide in which he had these pictures of indigenous people. In East India there are people who are, indigenous, native, they don't wear clothes and they're tribal. So he was showing them this is what Indians are, and we need to civilize them, we need to Christianize them, we need your money. So in the audience somewhere there's Iqbal sitting. Do you think he would let that pass? No. He became very upset. He actually went up in front of the audience and he said, this man is a liar. This is not how Indians are. I am an Indian in front of you. And do I seem like those people? Right? He's only doing that so he can fleece money from you. So this was his, you can already see that this was a person who was not to be cowed down by the great British Empire. He had this, this zeal or this enthusiasm in him, or this pride in him of his being Indian. Then you have this case about him meeting this lady called Atiya Faizi, and this is a person that he liked. Unfortunately, he couldn't marry. Nothing came out of it because she was from a very aristocratic family. Iqbal was from a very humble family, right? So nothing came out of that union, unfortunately. But he had his first out-of-body experience in Cambridge. There was a time when he was about to go to a picnic and he did not come out of his room, and the students worried, what happened to Iqbal? And they came to his room and they realized that he was staring into the void and he wasn't exactly there. So the vision was very unsettling. So the student came and actually shook Iqbal and says, wake up. And he woke up, and as if he came back to the earth. And he said to that student, and he said, for a moment my spirit was not in my body. I was somewhere else, in another reality. So this is one of the first experiences that we register in his life that was of spiritual nature. Again, he was very nationalistic until he realized what Europe had done. Europe had attacked each other. I mean, Europe itself was broken up into different, kingdoms and states, nation states. They were fighting each other. This is the point when Iqbal became completely disillusioned by this whole idea of nationalism. And he was in search of another ideology.